Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
I am joined today by Paul Heron, a culture writer with wide-ranging articles in places like Cafe Americain. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm going to ask Paul. As well as his Substack, which is great. People check this out for sure. Some Private Diagonal. Obviously, there'll be links to all this in the show notes. We're going to talk about a few of Paul's articles from Cafe Americain. But first, Paul, is that how I say that? Am I saying that right? That's how it's spelled.
It's almost. I think it's more like Cafe Americain.
Okay. All right.
French,
all right.
But no,
Sure.
that's okay. Yeah.
Sure. I did the what the Americans always do to the French language, which is just like nail it down and brutalize it in at the same time. So, Paul, first of all, thanks for joining me. You know, you and I have talked back when I was doing Art of Darkness. We've done a couple episodes together on Aikman. We talked about a Kafka short story in the Penal Colony and other matters Kafka-esque. And so I'm really glad to talk to you again, and I'm glad to see you continuing your incisive, always interesting commentary that I get to see. I'm lucky enough to see pop up on my feed every once in a while. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks, Brad. That's a very kind introduction.
Sure.
And it's great to be back, talking with you again after quite a few years. Since
Yeah,
we did those Out of Darkness episodes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so since then, I mean, I used to be Hegelian, if anybody's wondering where's this Paul Heron guy come from. So
Right.
you might remember Hegelian from Out of Darkness, a couple of appearances there. But the big change, I suppose, is I started publishing in magazines like Café Américain and The Critic as well in Britain.
Yep. Yeah.
And a couple of pieces in Unheard also.
Oh, cool.
So
cool.
the Substack is still going. Yeah, there's some private diagonal, although I don't post so frequently there. But But you have also, been very busy. You came out with a new novel. So life is proceeding well for both of us, I hope.
Yeah. It seems that way, and I always appreciate your insights. Even you're a good follow on Twitter as well. I mean, I always appreciate seeing your perspective on things. Obviously, you're a super smart guy, but I also feel like you don't get lost in a lot of us get sort of lost in culture war stuff to a certain degree. And I've always felt like you're sort of a voice of sanity in that stuff. You're not lost on the left. You're not lost on the right. You probably have opinions that maybe fall into either side, depending on what the situation is. But I just really appreciate that about you, that you're not an ideologue in any way that I can see it. So those are the kinds of people that I'm always looking to for insight.
That's right. Yeah, I put in my profile Grey Tribe. So that's
there
kind
you go.
of a shorthand for what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my background, I kind of grew up, as it were, reading a lot of leftist philosophers like Baudrillard, or very early on Chomsky was a bit of an embarrassing one. But
we all did. Everybody did. Yeah.
And even a bit of Marx and so on. And I don't really consider myself a leftist anymore, but certainly I keep some influence from, I don't know, Guy Debord, or certainly Baudrillard. I mean, Baudrillard himself it was kind of like a difficult leftist, you might say. Doesn't fit exactly into that category. But yeah, on the timeline, on X timeline, I try to avoid, kind of very obvious culture war type takes, and sort of provide my own sort of viewpoint on things as much as possible.
Yeah, and that's like I'm saying, that's one of the things I sort of appreciate about you, because it so much of the chatter in the algorithm is kind of it's not even that the things aren't worth figuring out and sorting through and learning about or whatever, but they kind of get taught. We can get very stuck, and I think we do need people like you to keep us from getting completely ossified. And one of the pieces, or one of your sort of efforts that I want to talk about maybe the most in this conversation, is a recent two-part series you did on the work of Francis Fukuyama, right? Now, the average person, if they've heard of him at all, they think, "Oh yeah, he's the guy who said history was over." LOL, right? It's very easy to, like many thinkers, it's very easy to boil down what they said into something like a meme, and then criticize the meme as though you're criticizing the person's idea. But maybe let's start with our conversation, or kind of continue our conversation here. Who is Francis Fukuyama, and what was he trying to say about the end of history?
All right. Well, who is Francis Fukuyama? Well, I guess he kind of exploded into infamy in a way in 1989, in the summer of 1989, when he published an article in a magazine called The National Interest, which is, it certainly was at that time, a sort of neoconservative publication. Um, and he published this article called "The End of History?" question mark. Now you need to remember this was before the Berlin Wall came down. The Berlin Wall
Right.
came down much later in the year. But it was possible to see what was happening at that time. The communist regimes in Eastern Europe were sort of unraveling, um, and Fukuyama basically saw this in his article as a kind of like a confirmation that liberal democracy had won, but had won in the realm of ideas, and he did make that explicit in the piece. It had won in the realm of ideas, if not actually, in fact, all over the world. It hadn't, it had, there weren't democracies everywhere, of course, in
Right.
1989 across the world, but there was a feeling, and I think he tapped into a widespread feeling that that was going, democracy was going to spread, as of course it did in Eastern Europe. In Poland, for example, which is where I am based, I live here, um, that democracy came to Poland, came to East Germany, which became, reunified with the West. Came to all these countries, eventually came in some kind of sense to Russia itself, yeah, a couple of years later. Um, and yeah, he announced what he believed to be the victory of democracy, but also, and this is often forgotten in the essay, towards the end of the essay, um, he said that the end of history will be a very sad time. Yeah.
Right.
And what did he mean by that? Well, he meant that kind of that the Cold War had given a sort of a structure to and a motivation for culture, for politics, for the competition between the two sides, civilizations of capitalism and
Sure.
communism, to sort of better themselves. And what he thought was if democracy wins, then this competition is kind of fade away, and there won't be a motivation to achieve so much. Now, where did he get this idea from, actually? That's an interesting point. Is he got it
Yeah.
originally from Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who had announced a sort of a similar idea. The essence of the end of history idea came from Hegel when he said back in the early 19th century that history had ended uh, with Napoleon's victory at the Battle of Vienna in 1806, which is quite a bizarre idea. Yeah. So,
It's
what does it? What?
from our
Yeah,
standpoint that seems. I have to admit, from my standpoint as a person born in the 1980s, that point he picked seems completely arbitrary. But I'm sure it made more sense to him at the time than it does to me.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you remember that Hegel, was famously, very enamored of Napoleon, and
Hmm.
he called Napoleon, the world spirit on horseback when Napoleon
Right.
kind of rode into his town. Um, of Jena. And anyway, he saw that victory as a kind of victory for the values of the Enlightenment, I guess, and the values of the French Revolution. So sort of freedom in Hegel's sense, which is too complicated a notion to get into here. But anyway,
Okay.
Hegel had the notion of freedom, and also reason. He thought it was, and he thought you couldn't have one without the other. You know, to have a reasonable society, must also be a free society, and vice versa. So he thought that rather like Fukuyama said, you know, he had won in the realm of ideas with Napoleon's victory, and then the epilogue to history would, in a sense, be the spread of these ideas and the realization of those ideas across the globe, across, you know, for the over the next few decades or centuries, however many it would take. But Hegel's view is maybe a bit kind of utopian, it seems, and Fukuyama also took a lot of inspiration from a kind of follower of Hegel, who was Alexander Kojève, who was famously gave lectures on Hegel, especially the Phenomenology of Spirit, that book, in the 1930s in Paris. And Kojève was a Russian-French thinker. And the twist that Kojève brought into the end of history, of course, he did announce, as you know, this 1806, the Battle of Vienna was the end of history to his audience, and many of them hadn't heard of that before, and they found it very amusing. But he kind of brought in a twist in that there's this idea of the sadness of the end of history, that at the end of history, there's something called the universal homogenized state, which is kind of like the solution to all man's problems in a way. But the
Right.
solution kind of takes man's, reason for being away in a sense. So
Sure.
so so
Yeah.
Kojève didn't think there would be art or philosophy in the future, with this solution arrives, and man would kind of regress, or he was regressing to a sort of state of the animality. So there's a parallel with Nietzsche's Last Man, which Fukuyama does bring into his book, which I will get onto in a moment, his book length treatment of this theme. So Kojève says, rather like impishly, kind of rather kind of making a sort of subversive, taking a subversive, putting a subversive spin on Hegel. So the end of history is maybe not such a great thing in every respect, because we
Right.
kind of
Right.
the future is kind of about, it's about economic activity. That's the only reason we have to keep going. Yeah? We only satisfy our basic needs because there's nothing more to do. So,
Right.
so
Right.
this was
Right.
a theme that Fukuyama also picked up on, but many of his commentators and critics didn't really pay attention to that at all. Yeah, this kind of
Yeah.
ambiguity or ambivalence that he picks up on. So,
Yeah, it seemed to be like I will say as somebody who again was only really conscious of the Fukuyama at the meme level and always kind of assumed there was more to it, but never spent any real time looking into it. I think my interpretation of what he was saying was something like, well, I guess we came to a point where we solved all the big problems or something. And so there wasn't going to be any more, we weren't going to have any more. I guess war would be one thing, but there was never going to be a famine that wipes out a huge part of the population or something. Like we'd kind of solved the problem of living somehow, and that always didn't seem quite right to me. And yet, I also could sort of see the point to that. That yeah, a lot of the stuff we have sort of a lot of the most serious problems for most people have been to some degree taken care of. But I really did appreciate in your article pointing out the sort of quote unquote sad part of this, if in fact we have reached a Fukuyama kind of end of history. And I just want to read I think this is the quote that you include. It's from Fukuyama, but it's in your article. Quote, increasing homogenization of all human societies, regardless of their historical origins or cultural inheritances. All countries undergoing economic modernization must increasingly resemble one another. Modern societies have become increasingly linked with one another through global markets and the spread of a universal consumer culture. So that, you know, I guess my question, like, I have a kind of question related to that. Do you think that's happening? Like, are we actually getting more homogenous globally? I mean, I'm in America speaking to you in Poland. I know you're a Welsh guy. We have probably a lot of similar cultural references, but are we part of homogenous? Have we become homogenous?
It's sort of yes and no, I think. Yeah. I think not to the extent that Fukuyama believed. I mean, he wrote that in his book, which was a kind of follow-up to the essay. It was called The End of History and the Last Man, yeah, without a question mark.
Right.
And that's a great book, but I have some issues with it, And I wrote the articles essentially because I felt number one was that Fukuyama was misunderstood, and number two that there's a lot of great stuff in the book and also in the essay which I wanted to highlight. So the idea of the homogenization, that was one of his arguments for believing that democracy would spread or will spread around the world, in that as people get richer, as they become kind of middle class, which is what he thought, capitalism would do, then they demand recognition for their rights, and they demand some kind of protection from,
Sure.
basically, their property being seized or what have you. Yeah. So,
Right.
so I think in some ways he was wrong there, but there is, I mean, I could bring in at this point the concept by Jean Baudrillard, which is the global, which I think is more closer
Yeah.
to the reality, which is that as the technology spreads around the world, I gave some examples in my article. Was like the example of the Taliban, yeah. So when they take over in 2021 in Kabul, and they have to learn Microsoft Word. Yeah,
Right.
this is, I mean, this is kind of like the global in action. I mean, we don't have all the same values. We don't all want, democracy necessarily, but we often, in some ways, we end up doing the same things and living the same way.
Right.
And another
Right.
example is just recently, the with the Iran war, and there was a tweet, like, you know, Donald Trump says, "Open the, effing straight, you crazy
Yeah.
bastards," and
Yeah.
but there was a response from one of the what was it, the embassies, which says, "We can't, we've lost the keys." And I did, when I read that, I thought, it's not the kind of Iran that I had in mind with the Ayatollah. Yeah, it's kind of it's
Right.
like an
Right.
Iran where people have been watching the same sitcoms as I have. So
Yeah,
you
it's
know what
got
I
that
mean?
same
So
sarcastic clapback kind of thing, right? That
yeah,
like, yeah, they
yeah,
just dunked on his tweet basically. Like, but the stakes are, are are incredibly high for the whole conversation. But yeah, you're right.
exactly.
I saw some AI generated sort of there's like an AI generated rap song that came out of Iran, basically
Hmm.
like mocking the United States government. And I don't know if it came from like official Iranian government channels, but it did strike me as like, oh yeah, they're talking in the same milieu as us. I mean, all these
Yeah,
efforts to sort of keep Iran and America culturally distinct from each other. Uh, and in American culture, we sort of never get to peer into Iranian culture, hardly ever,
hmm,
and yet there's all this interplay for sure. Like we're all sort of speaking the same language,
that's
not
yeah,
specifically, but yeah,
yeah.
it's
That
very
that's right.
strange.
And there was I don't remember the name of this guy now, but I mentioned him in the second part of the essay. Who he writes about the global mélange, about hybridized cultures. So I think that's more what's happening actually. It kind of goes with Baudrillard's idea of the global, where the global is not really necessarily human rights or democracy, but a
Right.
kind of like a shared culture, a shared grammar, if you like, where we all speak in terms of AI videos and similar joke, senses of,
Right.
similar sense of humor and things like that. But actually, we have at the same time we have different values. I mean, obviously, Iran is a Muslim country. They have a different idea of what constitutes a legitimate government and so on.
Right.
So there are still differences, but there's a kind of common language which is at play.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I think in that
And
way, in certain sense, that there's a kind of like an end of history, right, where we all end up speaking in a certain sort of patois, yeah, global patois.
right. Right.
Um,
And I do see how it kind of ends up being downstream of, I mean, even forgetting for a second whether or not liberal democracy is the best system, just that it
mhm.
is the one that kind of won in this sort of arms race of ideologies. I mean, I think we can say that's probably fair, even though it could maybe go in another direction at any given time. But like as you were talking earlier about this, the Soviets even became are in some level a liberal democracy, or the Russians. I did start thinking for a minute there. In America, we've been people who pay attention to such things and have parapolitical leanings. A lot of us have we've started to look askance back at the cultural output of like the post-war America and see things as being basically ops, like abstract art, supposedly, right, has had some degree of CIA funding. A lot of the rock music, there's always these implications that somebody like Jim Morrison was a plant or something like that. And then even going outside of culture into something like the first landing on the moon, as being something of an op. We're very suspicious of all that stuff, but even if the United States was involved in sort of faking all of that and fabricating a reality for us to live inside of, a lot of that was in response to what was going on in the communist country. It was a sort of a the idea behind why would the CIA fund abstract art? It was because we were trying to prove to the Soviets how free we were, right? And then supposedly like in the civil rights movement, there was a lot of concern about, we're sicking dogs on activists and spraying them with a fire hose. If the communist countries see that, we sort of lose this battle of who's more free, right? And that friction, I think, was almost positive for American culture. I mean, there's insidious aspects to it for sure. But then you take away that thing, and it's like there is no arms race of ideas anymore. It
Yeah.
does flatten everything out. It does become like, well, and then I feel like we just start fighting each other over like a kind of a narcissism of small differences, right? It's like, we
Well,
instead of like you live under an
yeah.
entirely different idea, it's like you have a different perspective on this one thing. Now you're kind of my enemy. It's very interesting to see happen.
I think, when Fukuyama came out with his essay in 1989, there was more a kind of idealism around democracy and the
Yeah.
West. We had a certain sense of what we stood for, I think. And we were proud of that. I mean, some of us, maybe most of us even, were
Yeah.
proud to
Yeah.
stand for freedom of speech and all those things. And all these things have kind of been eroded. Um, I mean, this was a point made
Oh,
by
lost you there for a sec.
um, what was the guy with the Clash of Civilizations? Yeah, the Samuel Huntington. Yeah, he wrote the Clash of Civilizations.
Okay.
First of all, it's an essay in response to Fukuyama, in fact, where he rejected Fukuyama's
Okay.
thesis. That was like 93, where he said, okay, we're not going to have democracy, across the world. We're going to have a clash of civilizations. That's what comes after the Cold War. We have, say,
Right.
the West versus he had about 7 or 8 different civilizations like Orthodoxy, Islam, Confucianism, or Sinic civilization, and some other ones. Yeah, and he
Mm-hmm.
thought that there were going to be conflicts along those lines, and that liberal democracy would not, successfully be exported outside the West, really. Um,
Mm.
and I think there's something in that. But one reason he gives, Huntington gives he wrote a book as well, he published it in '96, is that um, those values are losing their luster, the Western values, and I think that's true. If in the 80s, okay, there was still something, powerful there, but it wasn't as powerful an appeal as it had been in, say, the 50s. Yeah.
Right.
I think the West had a kind of more prestige. It had a kind of, authority in, say, the 50s, which was gradually kind of eroded
Right.
um, by things like, I don't know, Vietnam, loss of the Vietnam War, the breakdown of order in Western societies. You see actually a lot of the societies in the so-called third world. There's a period where they seem to be modeling themselves on Western models, either communist, which you can still consider Western in origin, yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
or democratic. And then
Right.
when we get to the 70s, a lot of them start turning away,
Right.
and you get the Iranian Revolution.
Hmm.
They start the leaders, like Colonel Gaddafi, start dressing differently. They start
Right.
dressing like Muslim leaders, not like secular
Yeah.
leaders.
Yeah.
And we see this kind of move away from Western secular ideals. So I think yeah, the West uh, lost a lot of its prestige, and by the time we get to, say, the early 21st century, then we've lost a lot, really. And it's hard for
Hmm.
us, we go into, say, Afghanistan, we go into Iraq, and these operations, were kind of influenced by Fukuyama's ideas, yeah, because he had a huge influence on neoconservative thought in the 90s.
Right.
And there was a widespread belief, that you could bring in democracy to Afghanistan, and it would be successful, or you could do it in Iraq. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember that being the opinion. I remember that
mhm.
being bandied about as like, well, we'll go in there and it's all you got to do is get the leadership out and all of the people will basically embrace liberal democracy overnight. Was sort of was sort of what people seemed to think was going to happen. I mean, I was too young and naive to really have an opinion about it, to be honest with you, but that did seem to be the consensus amongst leadership anyway was like, yeah, they'll everybody will just fall all over themselves to embrace this sort of way of living, and it was. I think there was the thought that the argument had been kind of made via culture, and but it hadn't, and maybe it can't be. I don't know. I don't know how easy it is for a culture that's it's hard, I think, for a modern person to recognize that liberal democracy is kind of radical in a pretty big way.
Yeah, yeah. And to be fair to Fukuyama, in the early 2000s, I think in about 2004, he began to distance himself from the neoconservatives, which
Right.
he had been a very prominent figure in that movement. But he came out against the Iraq War. He said this is a mistake. And I think it's a kind of implication as well that Afghanistan could be a mistake, although he didn't explicitly say that at the time.
Mm.
But what he believed was that the Bush administration in Iraq was trying to kind of like hurry history along, trying to force it along. And he thought you couldn't do that. Yeah, it's not going to work.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
if democracy is going to spread to Iraq, you cannot forcefully put it in there. It will just, it will just evolve over time. Perhaps that society will
Sure.
will adopt democracy. But the way Bush did it, went in and basically, sort of caused chaos by dismantling the army and the police and so on, putting a lot of men out of work, young men with weapons training, suddenly out of work. What are they going to do, right? So they,
Right. Right.
so Fukuyama thought, yeah, he didn't reject his own thesis, that saying that he thought democracy would spread across the world, but he said you can't force it. Yeah, so
Right.
so he began
That
actually to move, I would say, towards the left, in some ways, away from neoconservatism towards the left, but remaining a kind of social conservative. But he joined the Democratic Party.
Hmm.
He I think in about 2006 this was, and he also started to kind of push different kind of economic views, what we might call more socialist economic views, which is where he
Hmm.
is now really.
Right.
When you hear him speak, he's kind of more about intervention, about trying to reduce, widespread inequality, which he didn't really focus on that at all in the 90s. Yeah, that wasn't a concern really for him then, but now
Right.
it
Yeah, I
now it
did.
is. Yeah.
I
Hmm.
I did listen to a recent interview with him on the Doom Scroll show, which I haven't really listened to before. But he was on there, and it seemed like the most recent, sort of long form interview with him. And I was just curious, kind of where he is now, in his thought process. And yeah, he seems kind of socially conservative, fiscally on the left. He's making a lot of what seemed to me totally reasonable arguments about regulating industry, and sort of suggested it almost made me think that like I am keen on this concept of there being sort of competing uh, thoughts and competing sort of systems of economic and social organization, and you're kind of learning from the friction between them which ones work. And there was a sort of free market experimentation, it sounds like, based on what Fukuyama was talking about, and not all of it worked out all that well. I think that's probably fair to say. um, I was curious kind of your thinking on uh, so this whole thing in Iran. I mean, we usually don't get to every object level politics on this show, but I think this is definitely worth talking about in this context. We've got this thing going on in Iran right now. To me, as somebody who began to have a level of political awareness sort of post 9/11, right? Like, it happened when I was, I guess, 18 years old. And I didn't paid any attention to anything political until then. And so, quickly watched that turn into an invasion of Afghanistan, an invasion of Iraq that didn't seem like it made a lot of sense to me. And then saw that kind of proved out that those didn't make a lot of sense. And then now I see this thing in Iran, and it seems so similar in a lot of ways to that. Does it look that way to you too? Does this look to you like Iraq invasion part two in terms of the thought behind it and the perhaps naivete behind it?
I mean, if we talk about Trump's thought, then
Yeah.
maybe I think
Okay.
going off the New York Times had a piece recently where it said, okay, the idea of the war was Netanyahu's idea, and he sold it
Sure.
to the Trump administration, right?
Sure.
And I think probably I don't believe that Netanyahu seriously believes that you can foment an uprising in Iran and take over the whole, regime
Hmm.
with a popular uprising. I don't think he ever believed that. But that we did see an uprising, being fomented in January, I think,
Hmm.
maybe late December, which presumably they had some involvement in. They must have had some involvement in making that happen. Yeah. And I think that was used then to sell it to Trump. We can have an uprising and get rid of the regime kind of painlessly. They talked about the
Right.
Kurds as well. The Kurds could be an army going. I mean, it's always a bit fanciful and
Sure.
a bit kind of nuts. But I
Right.
think Trump coming off the Venezuela thing, which was such an easy win for him. I
Right.
think he was on a high, and he was ready to be persuaded.
Mm,
And we can see, really, I mean, I think it's a disastrous decision,
me too.
really,
Yeah. Yeah.
by by Trump to do this. And I think it only really benefits Israel. It's only really a war which they take any benefit from.
Hmm.
It's just a war to kind of deplete and degrade Iranian capabilities.
Right.
I don't think you're going to get regime change. Um, and you could say, okay, Trump still had this idea, maybe this kind of neoconservative idea that you can bring democracy into Iran. Certainly that was being pushed, right? For
Right.
some months, really, we're going to get democracy in Iran, that's going to happen. So they were playing on that idea. Um, but I think we can see that it's just this insane idea, really.
It
It's
seems
just
to
not going to
me,
happen.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In
And
this realm of like competing ideas, to me it's like the neoconservative idea of going to a Middle Eastern country and getting regime change. It seems like that idea failed. It's like it failed in Iraq, failed in Afghanistan. Okay, please let's not try to do that again. It just didn't. There was no. It wasn't. It didn't really end up being net positive at all.
right.
Um, and so
Yeah.
why are we doing it again? It seems like we're trying to play the same hand for a third time, even though it lost the last two times we played it. And then we're playing it against the country that is much bigger and has much stronger economy and an industrial basis and like has frankly a lot more people, and is actually more powerful than either of the two that we tried this maneuver
Yeah.
against before. So it
Yeah.
just seems it does.
Now,
I agree. It seems it's kind of insane. Yeah.
yeah. Now there's this problem with the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump has decided the solution to the problem is to completely close the Strait of Hormuz
Ah, yes.
by
Good.
by
Right.
by blockading it. So if you
Right.
can't get it open, then make sure it's completely closed. So yeah,
Yeah, that just seems like certain desperately searching for some bit of leverage or something. Even though,
yeah,
yeah, it's kind of it is sort of bizarre to see play out, especially like I said, as somebody who sort of came of age as the sort of GWAT was kicking off, to then see this
hmm
phase of it. We're just like, wow. So I feel like a little bit like, that meme of Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen comics where he's sitting on the moon and he's
right.
like, it's this year and this is happening. I feel like that's the same way. It's like, it's 2003, we're invading Iraq. It's 2026, we're going to war with Iran. And it just
hmm
seems like so little to be gained from it and so little sort of rationale. Hopefully things don't degrade into further chaos and death and all of that kind of stuff.
Well,
It's
hmm
unsettling to see. Yeah. Um, I saw that, I got thinking, I want to touch on relationship between what Fukuyama is talking about and a couple of other thinkers. One you already sort of mentioned is Baudrillard. Um, I've dipped my toe into a bit of Baudrillard. I think I sort of understand what he's getting at, but can you help us, if we put a Venn diagram between the thought of Fukuyama and the thought of Baudrillard, what's in the middle there? Where's their overlap?
yeah. Well, I think, Fukuyama took, as I said, he took inspiration from Hegel and from Kojève. So
Hmm.
he was kind of like he was doing some thinking in a sort of continental style, where he described a sort of metaphysical process
Right.
where, like you might say that somehow the impetus of history kind of peters out. Uh, and this is very much similar to what Baudrillard writes about.
Hmm.
Um, for example, I always mention this phrase from his book America, where he talks. I mean, this book he published in French in '86, and then there was a translation like a couple of years later into English, and he based it on a number of trips, to the States over many years, from about early '70s, I guess, into the '80s. And he was kind of obsessed with the deserts in United States, like Mojave Desert, Death Valley, uh, Monument Valley, and the book kind of in the book the deserts become a sort of metaphor for things,
Yeah.
and one of the metaphors, really the main metaphors, is the idea of the desertification of signs and men.
Mm.
So things losing the richness of meaning that they had, yeah, and people becoming, you know, people becoming kind of less than they were, yeah, like kind of
Right.
losing their spirit or soul or what have you, right? So it's kind of similar to what Kojev wrote and what and what Fukuyama talks about, the sad time of the end of history. Um,
Yeah.
so a later theme Baudrillard touches on in the 90s, in 90s book, is like the end of transcendence. So throughout history, let's say, man can find transcendence. He can find, if you like, God, yeah,
Right.
in different ways, yeah, through, I don't know, mysticism, through art, uh, through literature, yeah. Um, but Baudrillard says sort of in the late 90s, this is coming to an end, and now, the only transcendence we have is the transcendence of evil.
Ooh.
So the transcendence of good has ended, and now we only have the transcendence of evil. It's kind of like we see it
Yeah.
in the splendor, splendor of violence or
Right.
of horror, of nightmares. Yeah. So
Right.
this is an interesting, I think. I mean, this is something that Fukuyama doesn't get into. He doesn't really get into evil at all, yeah, as an
Sure.
idea, yeah. But
Yeah,
this is
but the
something which preoccupies Baudrillard for sure.
yeah, so but I think there's a way, I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this and correct me if you think I'm
Mm.
not seeing this right. I mean, there does seem to me that the sort of homogenization that Fukuyama is talking about and the loss of transcendence that Baudrillard are talking about are sort of
Mm.
two ways of looking at the same thing, right? The perhaps Fukuyama's is a little bit more of a secular perspective and sort of not seeing that what's getting lopped off is the transcendent. But I have a hard time seeing how this trend isn't the case. How we haven't at least lost some of the ability to achieve transcendence. I mean, I don't know how you can have a completely secular society. I don't know where you find that thing of transcendence when you have a completely secular society. It feels like it gets more and more difficult to find and more abstract, and then ultimately gets sublimated into other things. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think about this as one thing. And I know you're at least my age, probably maybe even a few years older. I'm not sure, but I'm sure that you are familiar with some of the what I don't think was exclusively American, but some of the Gen X attitudes around materialism and sort of having a relationship to sort of corporate culture and that kind of thing. And then now, sort of contemporary youth culture seems like it forgot all of that stuff, right? There's no, like, you can't, it's impossible to sell out anymore. There's authenticity is sort of more of like a set of aesthetic choices than it is anything about principles or whatever. And there's materialism is in like in terms of consumer materialism seems to be, from my perspective, in full swing. And I kind of wonder how that I'm just rambling, I realize at this point, but I do kind of wonder how that, like the old Gen X thing, even if it wasn't a religious impulse, there was this sense of like there is something more than the material plane we're in. Whereas the more contemporary youth culture is like, no, there isn't really anything more. There's just like what's around me, what's in my phone screen, what's in my
Right.
hands. That's kind of all there is. And so why would I? You can't. How can you not sell out? Everything's already sold out, right?
Hmm.
Or how can you? What is everybody's faking it anyway? How could you possibly be quote unquote authentic, whatever that means?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't
It's
know.
a
There
sense
isn't
of
really
like
a question
diminished
in there, but
horizons, I think. Yeah, diminished
yeah,
horizons. Like
right.
you can't see as far. Yeah,
Hmm.
there's not a sense of something, as you say, something higher that you could reach, which is maybe not visible, but it's there. If you look for it, maybe you can find it.
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean, one thing that preoccupies me, a bit is, I guess, what I would call the postmodern era, which I think is now finished.
Yes.
With books like Baudrillard's America, I mean, the whole of career of Baudrillard is kind of tied up with this.
Hmm.
The piece wrote, just been published just recently on the photographer John Margulies,
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
who's
Yeah.
photographed, roadside America, this kind of novelty and vernacular architecture of America.
Yeah.
And this I don't know, atmosphere, this mood, it's very hard to describe, I guess, to people who are maybe under 40. I mean, I'm almost
Right.
50, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm a little bit preoccupied, I guess I could say, haunted by this mood I remember, from my youth,
Hmm.
this kind of current of things, which I think kind of was killed off by 9/11, although it kind of struggled on. It struggled on for a few years, but it was not the same.
Yeah.
They say the 9/11 was the end of irony, and there's
Hmm.
there's a lot of truth in that, I think.
That's
And
true.
and there's a kind of this irony. People think irony is just like sarcasm, or it's just something unpleasant. But that's not really true when it comes to postmodernism and that era. I think there was something kind of metaphysical about it. Um,
Yes.
it's hard to explain it, hard to describe it, but there was a certain kind of spiritual dimension to postmodernism, I think, which has kind of gone. It's vanished.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to explain this, but this is part of what I'm doing, right? I'm trying to
Yeah.
write about this stuff to explain it and to understand it myself, what's kind of disappeared, um, and to try to evoke some of that feeling, I guess, so
Yeah.
that
No,
people, yeah,
yeah, I'm definitely nodding my head to all of this. I do think postmodernism is kind of over in a certain sense. I have more knowledge on the literary side of this, and I'll say I'm reading William Gass's The Tunnel right now, and it's just come out in a reprint, and I'm going to do an episode on it, and it's a powerful work, and it's brilliant in a lot of ways. But there is this sense. I mean, it came out in the '90s, and he was working on it through from the early. It came out in '95 originally, and I think he started working on it in '65 or '67. And so there's an interesting thing where basically the production of this book takes place through not the entire thing, but through a big chunk of what we would call the postmodern era in literature, at least, right? This 30-year chunk, and I do realize as I'm reading it, it's like somehow this seems it's written in 1995, but somehow it seems even more outdated to me than stuff I've read from the 40s and 50s. Somehow there is and I don't mean outdated in a way that it's not good anymore or something like that, but there is a kind of, it's difficult for me to put my finger on it as well. There is an energy there that we've lost somehow. I think if someone were to write The Tunnel now, frankly, it would just get overly bogged down in like culture war stuff, which it's kind of playing at, but it's playing at it in a time frame in which the stakes were different and the goalposts were different in that conversation. Anyway, all this is to say is I think you're right in identifying not only that postmodernism has kind of come to an end, at least as a sort of vibrant contribution to things, but also that it was sort of stumbling along at something metaphysical and possibly even spiritual. I don't know if it ever found it, I guess, but I
yeah.
think you're right that there's something there for
Well,
sure.
there's a very interesting book about Thomas Pynchon, um, which is called The Gnostic Pynchon.
Mm,
Now, I don't remember the author. I wish I did, but it was published about in 1990, and it dealt with, I guess, the books that Pynchon had published up until then. So he hadn't wasn't quite Vineland at that point. Yeah, it was
right.
like V, Crying of Lot 49, and Gravity's Rainbow, and I think a bit of Slow Learner, the short story
Short
collection
stories,
was
right.
mentioned as well. But yeah, the author, um,
Dwight Eddins, I just looked it
Dwight
up.
Eddins, that's him. Yeah, he was on
Yeah.
the tip of
Yep.
my tongue actually. But yeah, he kind of took issue with that. There was a kind of a dominant interpretation of Pynchon as a kind of postmodern nihilist. That
Mm,
his books are kind of there just to kind of demonstrate or to show you that any kind of attempt at finding some truth is futile. That was a kind of dominant interpretation of him in the 70s and early 80s. And Eddins took issue with that and said, no, I think Pynchon is on a kind of spiritual or religious quest in his books, and he's trying to find a higher truth. So he was a kind of dissenting voice, and it's a really interesting book,
Yeah.
in my view.
Huh.
And Pynchon
Yeah.
himself is very interesting for me. But even though
Sure.
I've only read, the first two novels and a bit of Gravity's Rainbow, I need to continue with that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I no,
yeah.
I like this. I mean, this is helping me. There does seem to be a thing. I mean, I think part of postmodern literature came out of, and maybe I'm wrong here and I'm not totally understanding the sort of historical progression of things, but to me, there's an aspect of it like 100 years before, I think there was perhaps this thought that, through industrialism and scientific advance and the production of new technologies and things like this, that we were gonna figure it all out somehow, right? We were gonna get the answer to the question of the meaning of the universe and everything. We were gonna do it through this, roughly speaking, sort of scientific enterprise, and then, post World War II, in very rough terms, is sort of this like, no, actually we're not, because we used all of that. And, look at, it's not that it always leads to World War II, but that is one of the places that process goes. So we can't find our meaning that way necessarily through this sort of scientific, technological, industrialist advance. And then postmodernism was like, well, man, the grand narrative kind of doesn't work, but can we piece things together in some way where we can find meaning still or find God still, even though we've kind of blown everything apart? I think that's kind of part of, and I think Pynchon was definitely doing that. I mean, Pynchon and DeLillo read to me, and I've read more DeLillo than Pynchon, but I think they have a similar thing in which they both strike me as, I could say this probably a lot better, but they both strike me as like people who'd never, it's like if somebody who'd never heard of the concept of God was like rediscovering him from first principles somehow, very slowly
Right.
and painstakingly. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what part of what postmodernist literature was doing. And then at some point it falls into, and part of how it did this was with a very playful attitude, right? It's always got to have a playful aspect to it. And somewhere along the line, I think it lost everything but the playful attitude somehow. Anyway, that's,
Yeah, you can go too far with the playfulness, and then it just all becomes kind of meaningless. Yeah, I mean,
right.
there were some examples of that, I think, in postmodern
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I'm a big
Go ahead.
DeLillo fan as well, I should say.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I'm interested in, I want to talk a little bit more about this article you've got on Margulies is his name. Yeah. And who's this, again, as you mentioned, this great photographer of sort of American roadside culture. And this all does play together because, I mean, as soon as you start looking at these photos and you start thinking about these roadside attractions, there is this weird, playfulness is chief among their properties, right? I mean, that's what is partially so interesting. And we're talking about, a giant fish by the side of the road.
Right.
There's a place near, I have a little bit of property in northern Michigan. There's a place near us where there is it's like a 40 or a 60-foot brontosaurus painted bright green just by the side of the road. I don't even know why it's there, to be honest. I don't know. It's just there. We drive by it all the time. And there's still a drive-in movie theater, and the wall between the road and the actual where you park for the theater is got all of these like the rear end of a 57 Chevy sticking out of the wall, and like a bunch of kitschy, cool, funny, objects. I'm sure somebody's going to tear that down any day now. But this is a peculiarly American phenomenon. I feel like this isn't something that exists much in the rest of the world, and I guess I could be wrong about that.
You're absolutely right, I think. I mean, I got into Margulies, I kind of inadvertently, really, because I discovered some years ago an account. I write about this in the article called Old Roadside Pics, and it had, these kinds of buildings. I mean, not only these novelty buildings, but just kind of hotels.
Right.
Some of them are kind of modernist buildings, you could say.
Right.
But there's a definite kind of aesthetic to Margulies' photography where it's always like blue skies, no cars, no people.
Right. Right.
It's kind of serene, sort of a utopian vibe.
Right.
Something about it just grabbed me, and it kind of made me think about Baudrillard, about America, and what he writes in there about what he calls like the pop and hyper humor of America, this atmosphere. So I kind of got hooked on that account, and then I don't know. Sadly, about 3 years ago, it stopped posting new photos, and
Ah.
it's still there, but there's no new pictures coming out. But anyway, recently I decided, okay, who was that guy who was taking those photos? I know his name was John Margulies, but who was he? And I started to research him, and I discovered that he was he was a really interesting figure in architectural postmodernism, and he decided in the 70s to start photographing these buildings because a lot of them were disappearing. And the signs also, he was a great photographer of signs,
Yeah.
of these kind of very, very colorful, almost like pop art, signs on restaurants and motels and things. And he started going on these trips. It was always like after Labor Day, I think, this kind of
Hmm.
late spring, before the holiday crowds. He would get a rented car, the biggest rental car he could find, and head out onto the map,
Yeah.
looking for stuff really, to photograph.
Mm.
And and uh, and he did this for like over 30 years, from like mid
That's great.
70s until about 2008, 2009, when Kodachrome, he used Kodachrome film. They stopped making that stuff and
Right.
stopped processing it. So that film wasn't available to him anymore, and I guess he decided to call it a day then. But by this
Oh
time
wow.
he'd
Yeah.
accumulated a huge, over 13,000 photographs, sort of archive, and this was acquired by the Library of Congress over the next few years. And sadly, Margulies died. It's almost 10 years since he died, actually. It will be next month. 10
Okay.
years. He was in his 70s when he died. And yeah, I just decided to write this piece about his photography. Um, and I sort of touched upon things like AI photography, so-called photography, yeah, and
Right.
how
Right.
it's changing the meaning of the photographic image,
Hmm.
obviously in bad ways, right?
I mean, I
Um,
think so. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But
Anyway, that
there's
was part of my thing,
yeah,
my interest in postmodernism.
I loved it, and I think I used to, or at least used to follow that Twitter account you're talking about.
Hmm.
There's one I follow now that's a little bit more regional. I think it's called Midwest Modern or something like that, and
Right. Yeah.
it's photos almost entirely of the Midwest, and it's funny because every once in a while a image pops up, and it's a building that I know. Like
Right.
he once posted a photo of a building that was like 6 blocks from me, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh wow, I drive by that every day, and I never really seen it out of context like that. It is kind of cool looking, right?
Hmm.
And so there is this sort of thing going on. I I I wanted to, thinking about the roadside culture, I was trying to understand, reading your article, I was trying to ask myself the question, like, why does this appeal to me so much? Because I feel the same way. I was just not that long ago in New Mexico, where part of the famous Route 66 comes from, and I basically drove all. Did I say Mexico or New Mexico? I was in New Mexico.
Right.
And I drove almost across the state, and there's not a lot of roadside attraction stuff anymore. However, you can still see traces of it in like a burger stand that looks very, of its own thing. And here and there, you're sort of seeing whispers of this roadside culture still alive. And I couldn't help but thinking about it, reading your work on Fukuyama, reading this work on Margulies, and these questions we're sort of talking about, as perhaps one of the reasons I like a big fish by the side of the road, or a dinosaur or whatever it might be, is it really does feel like a resistance to this homogenization thing that Fukuyama is talking about. Because,
Yeah.
yeah, if you look at any, I can only really speak to America. If you look at any sort of mid-sized city that's kind of had an economic shot in the arm over the last 20 or 30 years, they all start to look pretty much the same. They have a lot of the same, if they don't have exactly the same businesses operating there, they're sort of interchangeable. You can kind of, the food menus are kind of the same from city to city, more or less. There's edge cases where they're different or in that sort of thing. But, we have a lot of the sort of, the hipster burger joint is in every city, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And the roadside culture, anyway, I guess my point is, what I love about that roadside stuff is it's like, no, that's just some guy had a harebrained idea and built it. That's like, it's not getting handed down to him by the algorithm. Nobody said like, well, if you build the fish this big, you can expect a 10% increase in revenue. Like nobody made that kind of decision. And I think that's part of the appeal of that stuff. And unfortunately, we're losing it.
That's right. I think Margulies. One thing I liked about Margulies is that what I called his democratic sensibility. So he's when we look at the culture now of McDonald's or whatever, it kind of came about because of the interstate. Yeah, those roadside novelty, those wigwam motels and things like that. They were on roads which they had a dramatic loss of customers because people went onto the interstate as that network spread, and I think by about the early 90s it was basically built. Yeah.
Right.
So where people used to drive on the lesser roads, now they don't. And so those novelty, those roadside places lost their customer base, and of course most of them got demolished, right? But
right,
you've got like this kind of mom and pop store idea, where, as you say, some guy had an idea. I'm gonna make I don't know, a motel look like teepees or something.
Right.
And for much of the 20th century, actually, this was kind of considered kitsch and kind of trashy, honky tonk, right? It was honky tonk.
Right.
And Margulies wanted to change that attitude. And he kind of succeeded to some extent, that alongside other people like Robert Venturi, who I mentioned in the article, he was the guy who, along with Denise Scott, is it Brown? I think it was, wrote this book called Learning from Las Vegas, where they looked at the strip in Las Vegas and with an appreciative eye, which no architect had done that before. Yeah.
Right.
And so these kinds of interventions in postmodernism in architecture kind of changed attitudes, and it eventually lead to things like, Margulies' archive being acquired by a Library of Congress. So
yeah, how cool.
So this was a kind of another side of postmodernism, I think, is like the democratic side, this populist side, which actually the modernist architects were very snooty about. Populism is the masses, is trash, kitsch, honky tonk, right? It's not something we should be encouraging. Yeah. They also saw it as reactionary. Interestingly, they associated it with Nixon.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I can sort of see that.
Like populism was reactionary. It's kind of like modernism, high modernism. Is kind of like bringing the masses up, like raising them up to higher levels, higher expectations, but as giving them what they want, all their trashy desires, is kind of reactionary, right? So so they hated that.
It's bread and circuses. The TP motel is bread and circuses. It's right. I think I sort of see their point. I at least understand what they're talking about. But the flip side is just driving things towards homogenization. I mean, right now we see this in residential architecture like crazy. It's just like every house looks the same sort of inside. It's white walls. Everything's in sort of muted tones. And, part of that is economic because in the States anyway, we started viewing our homes as essentially long-term investments that need to maintain a value that we can sell them, so we can sell them off at the end. And so you don't want to do anything that distinguishes them in any way that could offend anyone. So they end up being these sort of like mediocrities that are hold their exchange value for a long time, and then that somehow becomes everybody's taste. Then that's what people actually like somehow. It's a very interesting process to see unfold. But the same thing is happening with McDonald's. I mean, I know you in other places like that. I mean, I know you've seen the side by side comparisons of the zany McDonald's of the 1990s versus now they look like a corporate insurance thing or something.
Yeah, very drab
And
now, right?
yeah, it's weird. And yeah, I mean, I suppose there's something there to the that is, it's hard to not think that culture is homogenizing when you see that not just happening to a particular entity like McDonald's, but happening to pretty much any franchise corporate entity, right? They all kind of harrow down to this sort of streamlined style. It's not really offensive to anybody. Like, it's never going to really bother anybody, but there's also there's also really no appeal to it at the same time.
There's no individual personality. Yeah.
At all.
I mean,
yeah.
there's that poster Paul Scalise, the Lindy Man.
Yeah.
And he talks about refinement culture, which I think is absolutely true. You can look at logos, for example, of companies since the 90s, and they look so similar now.
They really do. Yeah.
And they all have the same kind of messaging, all these companies. There's no real individual, identity to these companies.
And I think this is, I think it's very sad. I think it's mostly and not mostly, it's largely downstream of basic like economic decisions, right? It's because, I mean, my day job is in the civil engineering world. And so I'm a little bit familiar with, the design of civic structures and that sort of thing. And there is everything has become somewhat copy and paste because that's so much cheaper. Like, why design a new building every time when you can basically copy and paste the previous building that you designed and make a couple of insignificant modifications? And so everything ends up having the same sort of, boxy, everything ends up looking fundamentally the same for cost savings purposes, and I think that ends up translating to everything. And then, then you get the world we have to look at, especially in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah. Slop world, I think.
Slop world.
Not only homogenization, but it's a kind of degrading of standards. And effort, it's a kind of laziness you can see creeping into everything. This is something I absolutely despise, and I think it's one thing that motivates me to write. Is I want to put some effort into something and show that you can actually produce something which isn't slop. That's kind of that's something that makes me get up in the morning, I guess, is that kind of anger about everything being turned into slop. But
I'm with you.
And I think this is something, you can tie it to Fukuyama in a sense that and Kojève. I think in a way Kojève is a bit of a prophet of slop world. Talking about the loss of philosophy, the loss of art, and man becoming kind of like the animal, turning back to the animal state that he was in before the beginning of history. This is what Kojève says. And this is a nightmare scenario in a way, and I don't know what, I'm sort of fighting my own small battle against it, but I understand that it's probably futile, but anyway, we all must do what we can.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on this. I mean, I there's part of me that's even like, well, having a podcast, isn't that part of slop world, right? It's sort of, I do evaluate what I'm doing in those terms. Like, how much of this are you how much of this are you just going along with? How much of it are you kind of pushing back? How much are you trying to create maybe something that's a little bit askew and resistant to slop world? It's challenging, for sure. It's challenging to keep a clear head about it and not and be Like, you get AI stuff. I'll tell you, I don't use it at all, but there have
Mm.
been moments where I'm like, man, that would just be so much easier if I just used AI to do that.
Yeah, it's
Right?
tempting, isn't it? It's very
It
tempting.
is it is tempting, and at some point, am I just gonna do it? I don't know. Maybe, 20 years from now, maybe there'll
Hmm.
be such advanced AI tools that will be using 2026 Chat GPT as like a retro analog thing. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
something which is kind of heartwarming in a way is the way
Hmm.
people have turned against AI so much,
I know. I
And
love it.
if they
I love it.
detect there's some AI has a hand in something, it's slop, right? It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah. We hate it.
immediately, we hate it. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's something, with some hope is there.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah, I love to
yeah.
see that. I mean, I know we get a lot of the, you see on the internet a lot of the tech guys, and there's the weekly, oh, actors are cooked, and here's like a 30-second video that looks like crap, and here's, that's why there won't be any actors anymore or whatever. But
Mhm.
but yeah, I think the general pulse is resistant to it, and being sort of very much turned off by it. Yeah. I wanted to ask you. I got a couple other questions here. I mean,
Mhm.
this is sort of goes along with what we were just talking about, but the conversation more broadly. So Fukuyama, this end of history concept, which I think we've stated pretty clearly and kind of talked about the context around it and some of the sort of ancillary concepts associated with it. Are there films films, books, music that you feel like plays in that same territory as Fukuyama's ideas and maybe even Baudrillard's ideas?
Mhm. Well, in terms of music, I mean, it's a bit old now, but the vaporwave genre,
Mm,
which I suppose kind of sprang into being in about 2010, 2011,
right, right.
with albums like Floral Shop from
Hmm.
Macintosh One. It was, there's a kind of a pseudonym for Vectroid is the most famous name there, and
Okay.
other people, in that genre. Um, because they were kind of cannibalizing sounds from the 80s, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and also aesthetic things, sort of visual things like the World Trade Center or
Mm,
pixel art, the sleeves of Saturn games, the Sega Saturn games and things like that.
mm-hmm.
Kind of
Mm-hmm.
combining all that into an aesthetic, a cannibalized aesthetic, and also the music kind of comments on this sense of exhaustion, of cultural exhaustion. You know, um, it's distorting the sounds, a lot of samples, distorted sounds, a certain theme of being haunted. There's many albums in the vaporwave genre about haunting of some kind. We talk about hauntology in
Right.
British context, hauntological music. So yeah, there's a sense of something having ended, and now you're after the end. Yeah, and you're
Right.
trying to understand what has ended and where we are now.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, this music. I mean, we talk, in music, we now have Spotify and
Right.
most people, and other streaming services, right? And most people, it's become clear that most people are now listening to old music, and new
Hmm.
music is not being listened to in anything like, the levels it used to be when you and I
Yeah.
were teenagers, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of a new thing, there's like almost no forward momentum to music anymore.
Right,
Um,
right. That's been
it's
fascinating to
yeah.
watch to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is even like the vaporwave stuff, and this is not a criticism of it, this is an observation of it. There does seem to be this way in which it's almost like creating the music that we used to think would be the music that came in the future, right? It's like
Hmm.
some sense in which it's like we didn't actually get there to the future we all sort of imagined. So we're going to create the music that is suggestive of that future we never got, or something like that.
Right.
That's the feeling that I get if I listen to vaporwave. It's like it's almost like an alternate future that we could have had, or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's very interesting, and you're totally right about like the music. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what music would mean to progress. I suppose if I knew it, we would already be seeing it. But you're totally right that there is, and it's almost not even that it has stagnated so much, but there is a sort of exhaustion about, well, we already this end of music, almost like a Francis Fukuyama end of music, right? We figured
Right.
out all of the basic genres that everybody
Mm-hmm.
needs to cover the sort of emotional and aesthetic spectrum. We
Mm-hmm.
mastered all of the instruments. We mastered all of the technology that all the various production technologies. We've mastered, all of to make the distribution as frictionless as possible. What
Yeah.
else is there to do?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Mark
it's
Fisher was writing about this, in the 2000s
mm,
and the 2010s. And he called it famously the slow cancellation of the future. Yeah.
right, right.
And Paul Scales calls it stuck culture. Yeah.
Right.
And so there's a few different terms for it. But yeah, Fisher wrote quite a lot about hauntology, in music, in other
Yeah.
areas as well. That the idea of a kind of future which was promised but hasn't arrived. Um,
Yeah.
the
It's
futuristic,
interesting.
is now in the past. And I've written a bit about this as
Yeah.
well, but
Mhm.
it's such a huge topic.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, vaporwave was a kind of genre which is generally understood was kind of commenting on this phenomenon.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
but now we are kind of post vaporwave. I mean, vaporwave is still there. You still get a lot of these albums coming out on Bandcamp,
Mhm.
innumerable albums really. But it's
Right.
kind of like not there as a sort of a sort of influential movement anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, uh,
Do you see this is so we are seeing the proliferation now of AI generated music as well, right?
mhm,
And some of it is just sort of like some of it is sort of like AI kitsch, which is like, well, let's take the song we know and I want it to sound like as, a barbershop quintet making it or whatever. Some of it is just that, but it's being used in it's being used in other ways as well to kind of create original stuff. Um, I mean, obviously, I don't like this tendency, but it does make me wonder what the reaction from musicians will be to it. Like, what, and I guess I'm kind of asking you this. Like, how do you, if you have to guess, like, what do you think will be the response of musicians to this? What choices will they make? What might become fashionable? I guess I'm asking you to future cast a little bit, and I don't expect you to be quote unquote right, but like, what do you think about that? Like, will we go back to stomp clap because of this, or like, what are we
well,
doing?
I think one of the things with AI, I talked a bit about this in Margoli's
Hmm.
piece, is that it takes away the need for skills. So, of course, you've been able to, say, photography, for example, you've been able to manipulate photographs for decades. Yeah? And with
Hmm.
Photoshop, more recently, it's become easier. Yeah, but
Yeah.
you still needed some kind of skill, to do that.
Right.
But with an AI, image editor, you don't need any skill really. You just give it a prompt. And you get some kind of tolerable result, and that's the problem with for musicians as well, is that or filmmakers, that you could end up in a situation where the end user just says, okay, give me an album in the style of Pink Floyd circa 1969, yeah,
Hmm.
but with a female, I don't know, vocalist or something, yeah? And it will do
Yeah.
this, right? It will produce
Yeah.
that for you, and you can listen to it. So you don't need a musician anymore. You don't
Right.
need a filmmaker anymore. You can just say, give me a movie with Brad Pitt and I don't know, Marilyn Monroe or something. So
Right.
it needs to be a like a born Born Identity type thriller or something. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And it will make it for you. And so you get this kind of slop era where the artist is not needed anymore.
Yes.
So I think they're going to be very angry. And it's going to be like kind of like the Luddites again.
Yeah.
There's probably going to be some action, who knows what at the moment, taken
Yeah.
against AI. Um, but we shall see
Yeah.
what that means.
Yeah. I
The
think
same
there'll
with
be. I
us
think there's.
writers,
Oh
I
yeah.
think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's
Um,
going to be. I mean, I think there already certainly is this real significant pushback against AI. But I think just pushing back against it might not end up being enough, whatever that means. I think
mhm.
we might also have to be thinking about like I just recently have been trying to collect what I see as the AI sort of style and deliberately not write anything that could be mistaken as AI. And
Right.
that's easier to do now than it will be in a few years. I realize
Yeah.
that because it's going to be a lot more varied, and the users will get a lot more savvy about not using some of those tricks and things, some of the
Yeah.
sort of preset style things that AI is using now. But I do think occupying a space in which you're distinguishing yourself from the products of AI will be useful. I mean, part of I don't know. I think the AI stuff. There's a handful of things that the AI generated art, I think, is not capable as of yet of doing, and I don't know that people, you know, to use that terrible phrase, normies, I don't think or realize they're part of the artistic process, which is serendipity,
Hmm.
constraints, artificial or deliberate constraints or accidental constraints, and
Yeah.
then just the inclusion of the new, just something random almost, right? Which
Hmm.
I guess
Hmm.
is the same as serendipity. So it's like a lot of stuff, like, here's an example. Johnny Cash, it's just the first thing that comes to mind. When Johnny Cash and his band were starting up, they were not good at their instruments. It was like punk music. And so his
Right.
guitar player, I'm forgetting the name of him, basically developed this just like real hard edge strumming style that sort of sounds like a train. And then that
Hmm.
became the thing they did and people liked it. But really he did it
Right.
cuz he wasn't a very good player. And and
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And that sort of magic that comes out of the artistic process, I don't know that AI is going to be able to do
No.
that. That's not something it can
No.
take advantage of. That's sort of like, so those and so many moments in artistic history are like that.
Hmm.
A musician plays a certain way because they have limitations. A writer writes a certain way because they have a certain lived experience,
Yeah.
and the AI just doesn't have any of that stuff.
Right.
So all it can do is
Yeah.
copy from everybody else. So
It doesn't have any
yeah.
motivation either, really. Yeah. Like,
Right. Right. Yeah, it's not
there's
trying
nothing
it's not trying to
driving
get
it.
laid.
No, that's true.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
nothing driving it. I'm
Right.
saying, okay, I get up because I'm
Yeah.
angry about Slop World or something. So,
Right.
but
Right.
is AI going to be angry about anything? I don't
Yeah.
think so. So,
Right.
I guess they could
That's
simulate anger somehow. You could say,
yeah.
please write as if you are, burning with anger. Put that into
Right.
the
Right.
prompt, yeah, or something.
Right,
But
right. Yeah, I don't know.
um,
It's going to be interesting. I'm trying to become less of a doomer about it and more just curious and reacting to it, I suppose. But I'm
maybe
not.
that's healthy, maybe that's
Yeah.
healthy. It's,
Well,
uh,
it can get really. I think. I mean, I think it's. Well, I'm trying to maintain some sense of the transcendent, I suppose.
yeah.
Maybe that's the way of
I
putting it.
think this
Is
is
like.
what's missing from all the AI hype people.
Hmm.
They say, oh, this can create, a novel like Joyce or something. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Which hasn't happened yet, I think, but maybe it
No.
will one day. Who knows?
Hmm.
But they're kind of missing the whole point. Like, why did
Right.
Joyce write that? Ulysses. Yeah.
Right.
Why did people find such value in that?
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
uh, hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're still. I think the humans. I think we still got a ways to go before it totally, reduces us to
Yeah,
complete obsolescence. Um,
I
I
believe
do
so
want to.
myself.
Yeah. As we kind of get ready to close down, I do want to ask the question that I ask all of my guests, which is I want to get a little bit of the Paul Heron personal canon, and this is 2 or 3 books that are important to you that are maybe a little bit under discussed in your perspective.
Okay. One would be, I guess, Ian Sinclair, London
Mm,
Orbital.
okay.
Although I have discussed it on podcast with Yerk, you may know
Oh,
him.
okay. Okay. Yep.
Yeah,
I know you're. Yeah.
and I've written a bit about that. So it's a kind of psychogeographical classic. Sinclair walking
Mhm.
around, London over the course of a year, several, like 12 walks, following the M25, and he wrote a lot about the history of the different areas he walks through. So so that's one. Another one would probably be uh, the Atrocity Exhibition by Ballard, J.G. Ballard,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
um, which is kind of about the 60s, I guess, 1960s, as a kind of madhouse, as he calls it. So, so the
Mm,
idea that the world is kind of cracking up, and uh, the book is really a collection of short stories, but made in a kind of very that's put together in a very kind of experimental style, which kind of brings to mind, I guess, new wave French cinema like Jean-Luc
mhm.
Godard, or or maybe someone like Antonioni in Italy. Very visual. Ballad's always very visual, but especially
Yeah.
that book. So
Yeah.
that's another one, and probably the third one would be the Songs of Maldoror by
Oh.
Comte de Lautremont, aka
Yeah.
Isidore Ducasse from the
Yeah.
19th century, Uruguayan writer who traveled to France as a young man, wrote Maldoror, which is a kind of prose poem about a very evil character, but it's kind of also a comedy in a way. It's
All
a bit
right.
like the ancestor to American Psycho or Fight Club, perhaps, all those
Ah.
kind of anti-novels. Um, and yeah, it's very surreal. It was a huge inspiration for the surrealists.
Okay.
It's a kind of a gothic surrealist work, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
that book's been on my list
mhm.
forever, and I just have never gotten around to it. So yeah, maybe this will be my encouragement to actually finally read it.
Yeah, you've got to really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Cool. No, those are great.
okay.
That's perfect. I'm trying to part of what I'm trying to do with this show is like build a sort of almost an alternative reading list in a way, right?
Yeah,
And I'm always pleased people show up and it's like it's usually if it's not 3 books I haven't read, it's at least 2 books I haven't read every time I
right,
do this. So it's
right.
cool. It's I'll never catch up at this point, but it's good to it's good to always have something else I can read. Um, I guess sort of final question. What else do you have in the works? I mean, even if it's just sort of a general idea in your head, what's kind of next?
Okay. Well, I'm working on a piece for a magazine piece about Nixon,
Okay.
who I mentioned a bit earlier,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
as the kind of psychologically most interesting president of modern times.
Mm.
So that's what I'm working on now.
Okay. Very cool.
Um, yeah,
Are you listening
and
to the tapes? Are you listening to a lot of the Nixon tapes?
I've heard of some of them. Yeah, and I've
Okay.
got a book about the tapes. Yeah, he's such a. There's a lot written about Nixon, a hell of a lot published
Hmm.
about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a question of choosing,
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
what to include, really. You could
Yeah.
easily write several books about him, but
Sure. Yeah. No,
this is
that
just an
sounds
article.
fascinating.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Awesome.
Um,
Well,
mhm,
we'll keep an eye out for that. And like I said,
mhm.
I'll have links to your work in the show notes for people who are listening. But other than that, Paul, thank you so much for, having this conversation with me. I know it kind of went all over the place, but I felt like I learned a lot and I really just enjoyed talking to you.
I enjoyed it too. Thanks very much, Brad.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. We'll see you on the next one.
Cheers. Oh, thanks.